7-year-old girl steps out of a black SUV, locks eyes with the most dangerous man in the district, and silently mouths, "He's not my dad." The Mafia boss doesn't blink. He turns, drives his car sideways across the only exit, and kills the engine. Because in his city, using a child as collateral is a mistake you don't walk away from. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The commercial district off Calle Meridian didn't look like the kind of place where lives changed direction. Wide asphalt lanes, low-rise office fronts, a parking structure on one end, and a narrow one-way exit lane feeding back into the main boulevard on the other. On a Thursday near dusk, the lot held maybe 30 vehicles, and the kind of people who belonged to them, businessmen returning to sedans, a delivery driver stacking crates near a loading dock, 2 women in office clothes walking fast with their heads down, everyone occupied, nobody watching. That was the kind of street it was. Valentino had pulled in because his associate needed 2 minutes to handle a handoff. Nothing significant. He stepped out of the passenger side and positioned himself near the exit lane, simply because enclosed spaces had never agreed with him. He stood still while everything around him moved, and that stillness alone was enough to make people instinctively reroute their paths. He was 41. Lean, but built with a density that came from years of controlled violence and colder discipline. His suit was black, tailored close, no tie. The top button of his shirt sat open at the collar. Tattoos climbed from beneath the fabric, dark geometric patterns tracking up the left side of his neck, curling behind his ear, reaching toward his jaw. His hands were inked from knuckle to wrist, the designs dense and deliberate. He looked exactly like what he was, which was why most people on that street had already decided, without consciously deciding, to give him room. He wasn't watching the black SUV when it turned into the lot. He noticed it the way he noticed everything peripherally, without urgency. Large vehicle, dark tint, private plates, moving slowly, the way vehicles move when the driver is assessing rather than parking. The rear passenger door opened first. A small girl stepped out onto the asphalt. That was the detail that caught him. She was young, 7, maybe 8. Blonde hair loose around her shoulders, catching the last of the afternoon light. A black coat slightly too large for her frame, the sleeves falling past her wrists. She stepped out and went immediately still. Not the distracted stillness of a child noticing something interesting, but the rigid stillness of a child following an instruction she'd memorized carefully. Don't move, don't speak, don't draw attention. Behind her, the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was everything the girl was not: composed, unhurried, dressed in a white shirt, with the ease of someone accustomed to being the most controlled presence in any room. Medium build. Dark eyes already scanning the lot from left to right in a single practice sweep. He moved around the front of the SUV and came to stand slightly behind the girl, one hand resting briefly on her shoulder, directing, not protecting. There was no warmth in the gesture, no instinctive pulling close that fathers do, without thinking the unconscious gravity between a parent and child in an unfamiliar place. Just a functional hand, repositioning her like a piece being moved on a board. Valentino's eyes stayed on them. The girl's shoulders were rigid. Her chin was angled slightly downward. She was holding herself with the careful stillness of someone managing fear, not someone comfortable. And between her and the man behind her, in the space where ease and familiarity should have lived, there was only distance. Not the distance of a difficult day or a tired child. The wrong kind of distance. He couldn't have said exactly when she noticed him. Maybe it was the way he was standing perfectly still, while the rest of the lot shifted and moved around him. Maybe it was something more instinctive. That wordless animal awareness that even young children carry, that one is watching, and watching differently. She looked up, found him across the asphalt without searching. Her eyes were steady, not the wide, watering eyes of a child about to cry. Not desperate, not frantic. They were the eyes of someone who had already processed every other option and arrived, with terrible clarity, at the last one available. She held his gaze for one deliberate second, and mouthed 3 words. "He's not my dad." No performance, no reaching toward him, no visible distress that would alert the man behind her. Just quiet, precise, and trusting in the way that only someone with nothing left to lose can trust a complete stranger. Valentino's expression didn't change. Not outwardly, inwardly. Something shifted into alignment with a quiet, decisive click. the same internal mechanism that had served him for 20 years in rooms where the wrong read meant the wrong outcome. He had spent a long time building a reputation around the principle that emotion was a liability and mercy was a negotiating position, not a reflex. But this was not a negotiation. This was a child standing in his city, in his district, beside a man whose hand on her shoulder had told him everything he needed to know before she'd mouthed a single word. He looked at her for one moment longer. Then he turned, walked back to his car, lowered himself into the driver's seat, pulled forward slowly, and drove the vehicle sideways across the narrow exit lane. Engine off, door open. He stepped back out and stood beside it, hands loose at his sides, and waited. The man in the white shirt noticed immediately. He stopped walking, looked at the blocked lane, looked at Valentino. Valentino looked back. Neither of them spoke yet, but in the space between them and the golden, dust-lit air of that quiet commercial lot, something had already been decided. The girl stood between them both, small, still, watching, and for the first time since she'd stepped out of that SUV, her shoulders dropped just slightly from somewhere near her ears to somewhere closer to where they belonged. But to understand how a 7-year-old girl ended up standing in Valentino Sanz's district beside a man who was not her father, and why her real father was, at that same moment, sitting broken in a room across the city, preparing to surrender, the only thing he had left. You have to go back 3 days. To the moment the offer was made, and the moment Rafael Flores said no. Rafael Flores was not a criminal. That was the part that made it worse. He was a man who had made one bad decision inside a sequence of desperate ones, the kind of ordinary unraveling that begins with a medical bill, compounds with a missed payment, and ends somewhere so far from where you started that the distance itself becomes incomprehensible. He drove deliveries. He fixed things. He took whatever work arrived and stretched whatever it paid. After Clara's mother left, he became both parents simultaneously, packing lunches, braiding hair badly, reading stories he barely understood just to hear her laugh at his voices. He was not a criminal, but 3 years of drowning will make a man reach for anything that looks like a rope. Armani Douglas had found him the way men like Armani always found men like Rafael, through the gap between what someone needed and what they could legitimately access. The first arrangement had been simple. Deliver a package. Don't open it. Don't ask. $3,000 for 40 minutes of driving. Rafael had told himself it was a one-time concession to impossible circumstances. He told himself that, while depositing the money, he told himself that while paying the electricity bill and buying Clara new shoes and watching her face when he said yes to the school trip she'd stopped asking about, he told himself a lot of things. The second arrangement followed, then the third, each one slightly larger, each one slightly less deniable, and by the time Rafael understood the full weight of what he'd stepped into, Armani Douglas wasn't an option anymore. He was an obligation. The job that broke everything was different from the others. Armani had explained it simply, the way he explained everything, leaning back, unhurried, as though the conversation were about weather rather than the irreversible. A man needed to be intercepted. Not hurt, Armani had said, with the particular smoothness of someone who used that word as a courtesy rather than a commitment. Just stopped, delayed. Rafael would drive. 2 other men would handle the rest. Rafael had listened to the full explanation. Then he said no. Not because he'd found sudden courage. Not because some moral clarity descended on him cleanly. He said no because the man Armani described was a father of 3. And something in Rafael, something that had survived every compromise he'd made up to that point, simply would not move past that particular detail. Armani had nodded slowly. "I'll give you the night to reconsider," he said. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened. He had simply stood, straightened his jacket, and left. That night, Rafael had held Clara while she slept, and understood, with the specific dread of a man who knows exactly how these conversations end, that his no would cost him something significant. He hadn't understood yet that it would cost him her. The next morning, Clara was gone before he woke. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. She had simply ceased to be in her bed, her small form replaced by a phone not his with a single message on the screen. "Reconsider. You have 72 hours. She is safe as long as you are cooperative." Rafael had stopped breathing for a moment that felt much longer than a moment. Then he called the only number he had for Armani and said, voice fractured, that he would do whatever was required. Armani's response was measured and almost gentle. "I know you will, but not yet. Let the wait settle first. We'll talk tomorrow." The line went dead. Raphael sat on the floor beside Clara's empty bed for a long time after that. Her stuffed rabbit was still on the pillow. Her glass of water from the night before was still on the side table, barely touched. The ordinary evidence of a child who had existed there hours ago and now didn't. He had put her in this position, not Armani, him. Every arrangement he'd quietly justified. Every package he'd told himself was probably nothing. Every boundary he'd renegotiated with his own conscience in the dark. It had all accumulated into this specific morning, this specific floor, this specific absence. He called her name once, softly, as though some part of him hadn't fully processed what the empty bed already confirmed. The apartment didn't answer. He had seen her once since then. Armani had permitted it briefly, strategically, the way someone demonstrates proof of a valuable asset without surrendering possession of it. A parking lot. Daytime. Clara brought forward just long enough for Raphael to see that she was physically unharmed, then guided back before he could reach her. She had looked at him across the asphalt with those steady eyes of hers. She hadn't cried. That was the part he couldn't stop replaying. She hadn't cried, hadn't reached for him, hadn't broken. She had looked at him with the composed, heartbreaking expression of a child honoring a promise. "I'll do what you said, Dad. I'm being good. I'm waiting." He had told her through tears the night before she was taken, though he hadn't known it was the night before to always trust him, to follow his instructions, to be brave. She was being all three, and it was destroying him. By the third day, Raphael had stopped eating. He sat in the room Armani's men had moved him to, a mid-floor room in a building he couldn't name the location of, and he ran the same calculation repeatedly, arriving at the same answer each time. There was no version of this where compliance protected her long-term. Men like Armani didn't release leverage. They held it, used it, and when it expired, they replaced it with something worse. The only exit he could see was himself. He would turn himself in, offer full cooperation to whoever Armani feared most, give up everything he knew, names, locations, arrangements in exchange for Clara being returned to her grandmother's address by nightfall. He was composing that offer in his mind, rehearsing it, when Armani's man knocked on the door and told him to get dressed. They were taking Clara to the Calle Meridian lot. There was someone Armani needed to meet there. Raphael closed his eyes. "Hold on," he thought, as though she could hear it somehow across the city. "I'm going to fix this." He didn't know yet that someone else had already decided to fix it first. Armani Douglas had never been a man who panicked. Panic was for people who hadn't planned. Armani always planned. He planned the way architects plan, layered, contingent, with redundancies built into redundancies. Every arrangement he'd ever entered had an exit. Every leverage point had a counterweight. Every man he'd ever pressured had eventually arrived, through one route or another, at the same destination: compliance. He was not accustomed to standing in a parking lot watching someone block his exit with a car. For 3 full seconds, he did nothing. He stood beside the SUV with one hand resting on the doorframe and looked at the vehicle now sitting sideways across the narrow lane, unhurried, almost casual in the way it had been positioned, which somehow made it worse than aggression would have been. Aggression he understood. Aggression had a temperature he could read and respond to. This was cold. This was deliberate. He looked at the man standing beside the blocked vehicle. Black suit, no tie, tattoos running up his neck toward his jaw, across his hands, visible even at this distance, in the thinning afternoon light. Lean, still, looking back at Armani with an expression that contained no anger, no challenge, no posturing, just waiting. Armani had lived long enough in dangerous circles to know the difference between a man performing power and a man who simply had it. The ones who performed it were loud, raised voices, visible weapons, deliberate intimidation. The ones who actually had it stood exactly the way this man was standing. Something shifted uncomfortably in Armani's chest. He covered it immediately. He let out a short laugh, controlled, dismissive. "You know you're blocking a lane," he called across. The man didn't respond. Armani straightened, adjusted his jacket, walked forward 3 steps, leaving Clara standing beside the SUV, which was its own kind of statement. She was not a concern. She was furniture, and furniture didn't require supervision. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Armani said, closer now, voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted someone to understand the conversation had shifted registers. "But you're going to want to move that car." The man looked at him for a moment. "Is that your daughter?" he asked. The voice was quiet, unhurried. The kind of quiet that didn't need volume because it already owned the space it occupied. Armani blinked once. That's none of your concern. I'm asking the girl. Armani's jaw tightened. I said, but the man had already looked past him. Clara stood beside the SUV exactly where she'd been left, small, still, the oversized black coat hanging from her narrow shoulders. She had been watching the exchange with those composed, careful eyes, reading it the way children read adult situations, when they've learned that adult situations can turn quickly. The man looked at her steadily. Is he your father? Clara held the gaze for 1 second. Then she shook her head. Once. Small. Certain. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. To Armani, it felt considerably longer. Mind your business. His voice came out harder than he intended, a hairline fracture in the controlled surface. Walk away. Whatever you think you saw, you didn't. The man didn't respond. He turned, walked back to his car with the same unhurried ease with which he'd exited it, and reached inside. For one suspended moment, Armani's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. The man straightened up with a phone, made a single call, said 4 words Armani couldn't hear across the distance. Then he pocketed it, leaned against the hood of the blocking vehicle, and folded his arms, and waited. Armani pulled out his own phone. He called his security 2 men he kept within a 5-minute radius for exactly this category of situation. They answered on the second ring. He gave them the location in 3 words and ended the call. He felt steadier immediately. Whatever this was, it was about to be outnumbered. He turned back to the waiting man with recovered composure. You know who I am? He asked. The question wasn't really a question. It was an invitation to recalibrate. The man looked at him. Yes, he said simply. Armani nodded slowly. Then you understand this is a significant miscalculation on your... You know where you are? The question landed differently than Armani expected. Not because of how it was delivered still, that same unhurried quiet, but because of what followed it. A door opening on a vehicle parked 30 meters to the left, then another, on the right, then a third, behind Armani, from a car that had been there the entire time, without registering as relevant. Men stepped out. Black clothing, hands visible, no weapons drawn, and that absence was somehow more alarming than the alternative would have been. They didn't converge. They simply appeared, took up positions, and went still, disciplined, synchronized, patient. Armani's security hadn't arrived yet. These men already had. The understanding arrived slowly, the way cold water rises, gradual, then total. He was in the wrong district. He had known Valentino Sands operated in this quadrant of the city. He had known it the way one knows peripheral facts present in awareness, but not currently relevant. He had driven Clara here, because the meeting he needed was here. Because the building on this street held something he needed access to. Because logistics had pointed him to this location without his attention catching on the single most significant detail. This was Valentino Sands' territory, and the man leaning against the blocked car, watching him with that carved, patient expression, was Valentino Sands. Armani laughed. It came out slightly wrong, a fraction too sharp, a fraction too fast. He was aware of this. He suspected Valentino was aware of it too. This is a business arrangement, Armani said. Private, nothing that concerns your operations. Valentino looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. She was still standing beside the SUV where she'd been left, still wearing that coat too large for her, still holding herself with that terrible, composed stillness. He looked back at Armani. She's 7 years old, he said. She's collateral. Something moved behind Valentino's eyes. Not anger. Anger would have been almost easier to manage. It was something more contained than anger. Something that had made a decision, and was now simply executing it. No, Valentino said quietly. He looked directly at Armani. She's not. He turned slightly, and spoke to the nearest of his men 3 words. Low, unhurried. The man nodded and moved immediately. Armani's security arrived 60 seconds later. They took one look at the positioning of Valentino's men, the blocked exit, the controlled stillness of the entire scene, and they stopped walking. Clara watched all of it from beside the SUV. She didn't move, didn't speak. But somewhere in her chest, something that had been locked very tightly for 3 days, loosened just slightly, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time, shifting on its hinges for the first time. Someone had heard her. Valentino had seen fear perform many roles. He had seen it make men confess things they'd carried for decades. He had seen it make men lie so convincingly they nearly convinced themselves. He had seen it dressed as aggression, as indifference, as humor, all the costumes fear wore when it needed to remain undetected in a room full of dangerous people. He had never seen it worn the way this child wore it, quietly, carefully, like something she had folded into a small shape and tucked somewhere internal, where it would not inconvenience anyone or draw attention to itself, where it would simply wait, without complaint, for the moment it was no longer necessary. That, more than anything else, was what held him. He crossed the asphalt toward her slowly, not toward Armani, who was now standing very still between two of Valentino's men with the specific stillness of someone recalculating urgently, not toward the SUV, or the blocked exit, or the situation as a structure to be managed. Toward her. He stopped a few feet away and lowered himself, not fully kneeling, but enough to bring his face closer to her level, enough to shrink the distance between his presence and hers without eliminating it, because instinct told him that eliminating it would be the wrong move. She had been crowded by adults making decisions around her for 3 days. She didn't need another adult closing in. He stopped where he was and waited for her to look at him. She did, steadily. Up close, she was younger than he'd estimated from across the lot. The blonde hair had a tangled quality at the ends, the kind that came from days without the small domestic attentions, someone brushing it out each morning, someone making sure. Her eyes were pale brown, very clear, slightly shadowed beneath. She had not been sleeping well. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara." Her voice was small but not weak. There was a precision to it, the precision of a child who had learned, recently and quickly, that words had weight and should be placed carefully. "Clara." He said it back to her simply, not as a question, just so she knew it had landed. "Where is your father?" Something moved across her face, not breaking, but shifting, like light changing on still water. "He said he would pay," she said. "He told me to listen, and he would fix it." She delivered this with the careful faithfulness of someone reciting a promise. Not her own promise, his. She was holding it on his behalf, keeping it intact, presenting it now as evidence that the situation was manageable, that the terms were being honored, that everything was proceeding according to what her father had told her. Valentino was quiet for a moment. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Has anyone hurt you?" "No." He held her gaze one moment longer. Then he straightened. He turned to face Armani. The afternoon light was dropping now, the gold of it deepening toward amber, catching the edges of everything, the SUV's dark hood, the asphalt, Armani's white shirt. Two of Valentino's men stood flanking him at a distance that was close enough to be meaningful and far enough to be deniable. Armani's expression had settled into something careful. He was running numbers behind his eyes. Valentino could see the calculation happening, the rapid reassessment of positioning and risk, and available leverage. It was the expression of a man who had not yet decided whether he was in a negotiation or a confrontation, and was trying very hard to determine which framing was more survivable. Valentino walked toward him slowly. "You use a child as leverage," he said, "in my city." It wasn't a question. Armani's chin lifted slightly. "This is a private business arrangement. The girl is unharmed. Her father owes a substantial debt and refused to honor an agreement. This is standard. You brought her here." Valentino's voice was still quiet. It had not risen. It would not rise. "Into this district. To this street. The meeting required. You brought a 7-year-old girl into my territory as collateral for a debt." He stopped walking. He was close now, not threateningly close, but close enough that Armani had to make a small, involuntary decision about whether to hold his ground or step back. Armani held his ground. To his credit. "This is business," he said. The bravado had thinned slightly, but it was still present, still functional. "You understand business. This is no different from—" "No." Valentino said it the way you close a door. Flat. Final. "This is weakness." Armani went still. "A man who cannot collect a debt without borrowing a child to do it," Valentino continued, "does not have leverage. He has exposed himself." He tilted his head slightly. "You understand the difference. You're involving yourself in something that has nothing to do with you. You made it mine when you drove onto my street." Armani's jaw moved. He was searching for the angle Valentino could see it, the rapid scanning for a frame that repositioned this, that gave him something to push back against. Men like Armani always needed an angle. Without one, they became very uncomfortable very quickly. "You want a percentage," Armani said finally. "Fine. Whatever Raphael owes, I'll cut you. If you die here," Valentino said quietly, "who collects the debt?" The question arrived without warning and landed without ceremony. Armani stopped speaking. The lot was very quiet for a moment. Somewhere distant, a car moved along the boulevard. A door closed in the parking structure. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon, continuing without awareness of what was happening in this particular corner of it. Armani looked at the men positioned around him, looked at his own security, standing at the edge of the scene with the frozen posture of people who had correctly assessed the mathematics and found them unfavorable. The number didn't work, and he knew it. The bravado didn't leave his face all at once. It receded, the way tide recedes, gradually and then completely, leaving something older and more honest underneath. Valentino turned away from him. He looked at the nearest of his men, a broad, quiet figure who had been with him for 11 years and had learned to read instruction from posture alone. "Find the father," Valentino said. "Rafael Flores, whatever it takes. Tonight." The man nodded once and moved. Valentino looked back at Clara. She was still standing exactly where she'd been, still wearing the oversized coat, still watching him with those pale, clear, exhausted eyes. He held her gaze for a moment. "You did well," he said quietly, simply. Something in Clara's face, in the careful, composed, held-together surface of it, cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. Her chin trembled once. Then she pressed her lips together and stilled it, still holding her father's promise together. Still waiting. Rafael Flores had made peace with dying. Not dramatically. Not with any particular ceremony or resolution. He had simply arrived, through the quiet arithmetic of a man with no remaining options, at the conclusion that his life was the only currency he had left that Armani Douglas hadn't already claimed. And if spending it meant Clara came home, if it meant she walked back through her grandmother's door and slept in a real bed, and ate a real meal, and was allowed, finally, to be a child again, then the accounting seemed straightforward enough. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room they'd kept him in, and rehearsed the offer he would make. Everything he knew. Every name. Every location. Every arrangement he'd participated in from the beginning. All of it, laid out completely, in exchange for one thing. His daughter. Home. Tonight. He had almost convinced himself it was a plan, rather than a surrender when the door opened. The man who entered was not one of Armani's. Rafael understood this immediately, not from the face, which he didn't recognize, but from the quality of the entry. Armani's men knocked or didn't knock, and either way announced themselves with a particular energy, the low-grade aggression of people who wanted you to remember, at all times, the nature of the arrangement. This man entered, the way someone enters a room they have already decided belongs to them. Calm, unhurried, taking in the space with a single sweep before settling his attention on Rafael. "Rafael Flores," he said. Not a question. Rafael stood slowly. "Who are you?" "Someone sent to find you." The man moved to the window, checked the street below with a practiced glance, then turned back. "You have a daughter, Clara, 7 years old." Rafael's chest contracted. "Where is she? She's safe." The man said it with a flatness that was somehow more convincing than reassurance would have been. This was not comfort being offered. This was information. "She's been removed from Douglas's control. I need you to come with me." Rafael stared at him. "Who sent you?" he said again. The man looked at him steadily. "Valentino Sanz." The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. Rafael had heard it the way everyone in this city had heard it, in careful, peripheral ways. Never directly, never loudly. The kind of name that existed in conversation as a reference point rather than a subject, the way people reference weather systems or geographical features, something large and real that shaped the landscape without requiring discussion. He had never had reason to think that name had anything to do with him. "Why?" Rafael said carefully. "Would Valentino Sanz send someone to find me? Your daughter mouthed 3 words to him in a parking lot this afternoon." The man's expression didn't change. He understood them. "That's all you need to know right now." Rafael sat back down on the edge of the bed. He pressed both hands over his face and stayed like that for a long moment, not crying, not speaking, just existing inside the specific, overwhelming relief of a man who has been carrying an unbearable weight and has just been told, without warning, that someone else has taken hold of the other end. His shoulders shook once, then he steadied himself, dropped his hands, and stood. "Take me to her," he said. Across the city, Valentino's men were moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of work long enough that it no longer required discussion. 2 teams, separate routes. One tracking Armani's secondary holding locations, The places men like Armani kept people when they needed them, accessible but invisible. The other running Raphael's name through the network of contacts and informants that Valentino had spent 2 decades cultivating in exactly this city, for exactly this category of situation. It had taken 40 minutes to find him. Valentino received the confirmation on his phone and read it without expression. He pocketed the phone and looked across the lot to where Clara sat in the back seat of one of his vehicles, door open, one of his men standing at a respectful distance nearby. She had been given water and a jacket that was warmer than the oversized coat. She was sitting with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap, looking out through the open door at nothing in particular. She had not asked for anything. She had not complained. She had simply waited, with that same composed and heartbreaking patience, for whatever came next. Valentino watched her for a moment. He had extracted people from situations before. It was not uncommon work in his world. Leverage moved in all directions, and occasionally redirecting it served purposes that aligned with his own interests. He had never confused this for altruism. It was always strategic, always calculated. The moral dimension of it was incidental. He told himself this now. Watching the child sit in the back seat of his car with her hands folded, he was not entirely convinced. Armani was being held in the kind of comfortable containment that Valentino preferred: no physical coercion, no explicit threat, simply the presence of enough disciplined men in a small enough space that movement became a theoretical rather than practical option. He had made 2 phone calls, both of which had been permitted. He had eaten, which had also been permitted. He had not been harmed. This, Valentino knew, was its own kind of message. Men who wanted to frighten you hurt you immediately. Men who were genuinely more powerful than you didn't need to. They simply made the architecture of the situation clear and waited for you to stop arguing with it. Armani had stopped arguing with it approximately 20 minutes ago. Valentino had been told this by the man supervising him, who described it simply as, he went quiet. Good. Quiet meant calculating. Calculating meant Armani was looking for the exit that cost him least, which meant when Valentino sat down across from him, the conversation would move efficiently, but that conversation was for later. Right now, a car was moving across the city carrying Rafael Flores, beaten, hollow-eyed, 3 days unwashed, running entirely on the fuel of a father who had not yet seen his daughter toward the street where Clara was waiting. Valentino's man had sent a single update from the vehicle. He hasn't stopped shaking since we told him she's safe. Valentino read it, set the phone face down on the hood of the car, looked up at the amber sky above the district, the last light of the day dissolving into something darker and quieter. He thought about what Clara had said when he'd told her she'd done well, the way her chin had trembled once before she steadied it. 7 years old, holding her father's promise together with both hands. Hold on, he thought, though not to anyone in particular. He's almost here. The car carrying Rafael arrived at 6:47 inches the evening. Valentino knew the exact time because he checked not from impatience, but from the habit of a man who understood that timing was its own kind of leverage, and that the sequence in which things happened mattered as much as the things themselves. He had arranged this deliberately. Armani first, then Rafael, then Clara, brought forward at the precise moment the dynamic in the room had been sufficiently restructured. Order mattered, control mattered. He reminded himself of this as the vehicle pulled into the lot. Rafael Flores stepped out, and Valentino catalogued him in a single glance. 40, maybe 42. Medium height, slightly built, the kind of build that came from years of physical work rather than intention, functional rather than cultivated. His face carried 3 days of stubble and something older than exhaustion. His left eye was swollen at the corner, a bruise yellowing toward the cheekbone. His lip had been split and had healed badly in the interim. He walked with the slightly careful gait of someone managing ribs that had been introduced to a blunt object. He had been beaten. Not savagely, Armani had wanted compliance. Not incapacitation, but enough to demonstrate that the arrangement was not theoretical. What struck Valentino most was the eyes. They moved immediately, instinctively, to every corner of the lot, in rapid sequence, not threat assessment, not the trained scan of someone experienced in dangerous environments. It was something rawer than that, something animal. He was looking for his daughter. Valentino stepped forward. "She's here," he said. "She's safe. You'll see her in a few minutes." Rafael turned to him. Something in his expression fractured slightly at the confirmation, a hairline crack in the surface of a man who had been holding himself together through sheer necessity and was now, for the first time in 3 days, being told he could stop. He pressed his lips together, nodded. "Thank you," he said. His voice was barely functional. "Don't thank me yet," Valentino said. "We have something to finish first." Armani was brought out 2 minutes later. He walked into the lot with the contained composure of a man who had made his calculations and arrived at his position and intended to hold it with dignity. His shirt was still neat. His expression was still controlled. He looked at Raphael with the flat, assessing gaze of a creditor examining a debtor, habitual, reflexive, as though the last several hours had not materially altered the fundamental nature of their relationship. Then he looked at Valentino. The composure thinned slightly. "Let's resolve this," Armani said. "Yes," Valentino agreed. "Let's." He positioned himself between the two men, not mediating, not facilitating, simply occupying the center of the space in a way that made clear who had convened this meeting and who was running it. "The debt," Valentino said to Armani. "What is the original figure?" Armani named it. Valentino looked at Raphael. Raphael confirmed it with a single nod, the nod of a man past the point of strategic concealment. "The job he refused," Valentino continued. "Describe it." Armani's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant to—" "Describe it." The quiet was absolute. Armani described it. Valentino listened without interruption. When Armani finished, Valentino was silent for a moment. Not processing, he had already known the shape of it from what his men had gathered over the preceding hours. He was simply allowing the description to sit in the open air between the three of them, where it could be properly examined. "You asked him to participate in a violent interception," Valentino said. He declined. "You responded by taking his child." He looked at Armani steadily. "That is not a business dispute. That is a crime committed inside my territory against a civilian family. You understand the distinction. The debt is legitimate. The debt is not in question." Valentino's voice remained level. "The method is. You escalated a financial arrangement into the abduction of a child. That changes what you're owed." Armani stared at him. "You're restructuring my agreement. I'm defining what you're permitted to collect." Valentino looked at Raphael. "The original sum, cash, paid in installments over 18 months at a schedule his income can sustain. No jobs, no arrangements, no involvement in operations." He looked back at Armani. "You collect the money. Nothing else. The family is off limits from this moment. That's not the alternative," Valentino said quietly, "is that I take the position that what happened here today constitutes a significant violation of territorial conduct, and I respond accordingly." He paused. "You know what accordingly means." The lot was very quiet. Somewhere in the parking structure above them, a car engine turned over and faded. The last amber light had dissolved from the sky, leaving something blue and cooling in its place. The overhead lights of the lot had flickered on, casting everything in a flat, even illumination that left nowhere to hide. Armani stood in the center of it and did his arithmetic one final time. The numbers had not changed since the last time he'd run them. They would not change. Valentino's men were positioned. His own security had been neutralized, not harmed, simply redirected, which was somehow more humiliating than the alternative. There was no version of this scenario in which force produced a favorable outcome. There was no exit, only terms. He exhaled slowly through his nose. 18 months, he said. 18 months, Valentino confirmed. And the family is clear. The family is clear. Armani looked at Raphael for a long moment with the expression of a man filing away a debt that was no longer financial. Then he looked away. "Fine," he said. Valentino turned to his man on the right and gave a single nod. The man walked to the vehicle where Clara had been waiting and opened the rear door. She stepped out. She stood at the edge of the lot in her oversized coat, pale and small in the flat overhead light, and looked across the asphalt. Raphael saw her. Whatever had been holding him together, the necessity, the focus, the requirement to remain functional through the meeting, released completely and instantaneously. The way a held breath releases, the way a fist unclenches after hours of gripping. He crossed the distance between them in 5 steps and dropped to his knees in front of her. His arms went around her. Clara pressed her face into his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Valentino watched from where he stood. He did not look away. Rafael Flores had rehearsed this moment approximately 10,000 times in 3 days. Not the logistics of it, he hadn't allowed himself the luxury of logistics, because logistics required believing the moment would actually arrive, and believing that had felt. At certain points in the preceding 72 hours, like a cruelty rather than a comfort. But the feeling of it, the specific weight of her, the way she tucked her head against him when she was tired or scared, the smell of her hair, the particular sound she made when she cried, not loud, never loud, but a small, hiccuping thing that she'd had since infancy, and that he could identify in a crowded room with his eyes closed. He had rehearsed the feeling 10,000 times, and it still arrived like something completely new. She was so small. That was the thing that undid him first. He had known she was small. She was 7. She had always been small. Small was simply what she was. But 3 days of catastrophic imagination had somehow enlarged her in his mind, made her into something more substantial, as though the magnitude of his fear had transferred itself to her form. Now, holding her, she was just his daughter, small and real and present. He pressed his face into her hair and felt the shaking start in his chest, the deep structural shaking of a man whose body is finally permitted to process what his mind had been refusing for 72 hours. His arms tightened around her. Not crushing, he was careful, even now, even in this, but close as he could manage. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The words came out broken at the edges. He had planned to say something more coherent, something worthy of the moment, something that might begin to address the distance between what he'd put her through and what she deserved. But coherence wasn't available to him right now. Only this. Only the 2 words that had been building pressure behind everything else for 3 days. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm sorry." Clara's arms were around his neck. She didn't speak immediately. She let him hold her and let him say it, and breathed against his shoulder with a steadiness that was both extraordinary and heartbreaking in a person her size and age. Then she said, quietly, into the fabric of his jacket, "I did what you said." Raphael pulled back just far enough to look at her face. Her eyes were dry. She had not cried, not in front of him, not yet. Her expression held that composed, careful quality he'd seen from across the parking lot 3 days ago, when Armani had brought her forward as proof of concept. The same expression that had been destroying him in memory every hour since. He searched her face, looking for damage, looking for the thing that 3 days of this had taken from her, that he might never be able to return. "I know you did," he managed. "I know, you were so brave. You said to listen," she said. "You said you'd fix it. I know, so I listened." She said it simply, factually, as though the logic of it were self-evident, as though obedience had been the most natural response in the world, as though trusting him had cost her nothing at all. It had cost her everything, and she was presenting it to him as a gift. Raphael made a sound that was not quite a word and pulled her back in, and this time she let him, her small hands gripping the back of his jacket with a tightness that told him, more clearly than anything she'd said, exactly how afraid she had been. She hadn't shown it, but it had been there the entire time. Valentino stood at the edge of the scene, not close. He had positioned himself at a deliberate distance, near enough to observe, far enough to give the space its privacy. His men had done the same, the quiet recession of people who understood the difference between a moment that required their presence and one that required their absence. He watched Raphael hold his daughter in the flat overhead light of the lot. He had witnessed reunions before. In his work, in his world, things were taken and returned, and the returning was transactional, an exchange completing, a ledger closing, a debt resolved. The emotion of it was incidental. Background noise. He had never found it particularly difficult to maintain his distance from it. He was finding it slightly more difficult tonight. He couldn't have said precisely why. The mechanics of what had happened here were not unfamiliar. Child used as leverage, it was not. In the world he occupied, without precedent. He had resolved the situation with the same tools he used to resolve all situations: positioning, calculation, the correct application of pressure at the correct moment. It had worked exactly as intended, so the feeling sitting in his chest right now was not logical. He observed it with the detached curiosity he applied to most things that didn't fit his existing categories. It was not quite discomfort, not quite satisfaction either. Something between the two, a low, quiet hum in the region just below his sternum that didn't have a name he could readily locate. He was still examining it when he heard small footsteps. Clara was walking toward him. Raphael had tried to follow Valentino, saw the instinctive movement, the protective lean forward, but something in Clara's posture must have communicated that she was doing this herself, because Raphael stilled. He straightened slowly, watched her go. She crossed the distance between them steadily. She stopped in front of Valentino and looked up at him the way she had looked at him across the lot that afternoon. Direct, unhurried, asking nothing. He looked down at her. "I didn't know if you were safe," she said. Valentino studied her. "What do you mean?" "When you blocked the road." She considered her words with care. He was angry. "I didn't know if it would be okay. For you." Something shifted in Valentino's chest. She had been worried. In the middle of all of it, the fear, the exhaustion, the 3 days of holding herself together, she had found space to be worried about him. "I was fine," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. She nodded, accepting this. Then she looked at him with those pale, clear eyes. "Why did you help?" she asked. "You didn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." She seemed to consider this answer. Then, with the particular gravity of a 7-year-old, delivering a conclusion she had reached through genuine reasoning. "You looked like someone who doesn't look away." Valentino held her gaze. In 20 years, in this city, in this life, men had called him many things, feared him, avoided him, respected him in the careful, self-interested way that people respect things that could harm them. No one had ever seen him quite like that. He didn't respond immediately, because for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know what to say. Valentino didn't sleep that night. This was not unusual. Sleep had always been a negotiation for him, something he entered cautiously and exited easily, never fully surrendering to it the way other people seemed to. His mind didn't quiet on command. It catalogued, assessed, ran scenarios, filed details. It had been doing this since he was 19 years old and had learned, through a specific and formative piece of violence, that the world did not pause for the unprepared. But tonight the cataloging had a different texture. He sat in the back office of the building on Calle Meridian, his building, on his street, in the district that bore his name in every conversation that mattered in this city, and he did not review accounts or assess operations or plan the week's movements. He sat with a glass of water he hadn't drunk and thought about a 7-year-old girl telling him he looked like someone who doesn't look away. He turned the sentence over slowly, examining it from different angles the way you examine an object you've found unexpectedly, trying to determine what it is and where it belongs. He had built his reputation on a specific and consistent principle, not cruelty. Cruelty was inefficient. And Valentino had always been, above everything else, efficient. Not fear exactly, though fear was a natural byproduct of the work. The principle was simpler than either of those things, and more durable. Clarity. He was clear about what he would do and what he would not do, clear about what he required and what he would accept, clear about the lines that existed in his operations and what happened when those lines were crossed. Clarity was power. Everything else was theater. What he was sitting with tonight was a new line. Not new in the sense of something he hadn't felt before. He had always had a particular and private aversion to the use of children in criminal leverage. It was one of the things he had never permitted in his own operations. Quietly and without announcement, the way certain principles exist in a person's conduct, without ever being articulated aloud. But aversion and prohibition were different things. Tonight had made it a prohibition. He called his senior man at 11:30. The man answered on the first ring. He always answered on the first ring and waited without speaking. He had learned, over 11 years, that Valentino's calls at unusual hours contained instructions rather than conversation, and that the most useful thing he could do was be quiet and listen. "I want it known," Valentino said, "that this district and any operation running under my name or my protection does not use family members as leverage, not wives, not parents." He paused. "Not children." A brief silence. "Understood," the man said. "I want it communicated clearly. To everyone currently operating here. To anyone seeking to operate here. To Armani Douglas specifically." He looked at the untouched glass of water on the desk. "If it happens again by anyone, the protection ends. Completely. I'll have it out by morning." "Tonight," Valentino said. "Tonight," the man confirmed. The call ended. Word moved the way word always moved in this city, not through announcements or declarations, but through the careful channels of people who understood that information was currency and that Valentino Sanz's instructions were not suggestions. By midnight, it had reached the 3 other significant operations running in adjacent districts. By 2 in the morning, it had filtered to the peripheral networks, the smaller arrangements, the independent operators, the men who worked the edges of things. By dawn, it was simply known. In Valentino's territory, children were off limits. The response, relayed back to him through his senior man over the following days, was varied. Some received it with genuine relief. There were men in this world who operated by necessity rather than inclination, who had their own private lines and had simply never had the standing to enforce them. Others received it with the careful neutrality of people recalibrating risk assessments. A small number received it with the muted resentment of those whose methods had just been constrained. None of them argued with it. Armani Douglas received it in writing. A single page, precise language, the terms of the restructured debt, the schedule of repayment, and a final paragraph that required no interpretation. The Flores family was untouchable. Any approach, any surveillance, any attempt to reopen the original arrangement would constitute a direct violation of the agreement made on Calle Meridian. The consequences were not specified. They didn't need to be. Armani signed it. Valentino filed it. Rafael Flores received a different kind of communication. Not written, delivered in person, by the same quiet man who had brought him across the city the night before. Simple terms. The debt stood, but the structure had changed. Manageable payments. No involvement. No arrangements. His daughter's name would not appear in any conversation connected to any operation in this city for as long as Valentino Sanz had standing to enforce that. Rafael had listened to all of it, with the expression of a man still slightly disoriented by the fact that he was alive and intact, and his daughter was home. Then he asked the only question that had been waiting behind everything else since the lot. Why did he do this? The man considered the question briefly. He saw your daughter in his street, he said. And he made a decision. Rafael nodded slowly. He sat with that for a long time after the man left. Clara went back to school on the Thursday. Rafael had offered to keep her home longer, a week, 2 weeks, whatever she needed. She had considered this offer with characteristic seriousness, turning it over the way she turned most things over, and then declined it. She wanted to go back. She wanted her desk and her teacher, and the particular smell of the classroom in the morning and the specific noise of the playground at lunch. She wanted ordinary. Rafael understood. Ordinary was the thing that had been taken. Ordinary was therefore the thing that needed to be restored. He walked her to school himself, both ways, that first week. Then most days after that. A small restructuring of his schedule that cost him 2 delivery runs a week, and that he considered, without hesitation, the best investment he'd ever made. On the Friday evening of Clara's first week back, she sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, and asked, without looking up from her worksheet, "Is Valentino a good person?" Rafael paused. He thought about the man standing in the amber light of the commercial lot. The tattoos. The stillness. The absolute, unambiguous authority of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous presence in any room he entered. He thought about the blocked exit, the restructured debt, the page with Armani's signature on it, currently in an envelope in the back of his desk drawer. He thought about Clara walking toward that man across the asphalt with her small, steady steps. "I think," Rafael said carefully, "that he's a complicated person who made a good decision." Clara considered this with her pencil hovering over the worksheet. "I think he's good," she said. "He just doesn't know it yet." She went back to her homework. Rafael stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his daughter, small and intact, and ordinary in the best possible sense, bent over a mathematics worksheet in the yellow kitchen light. He thought about what it had cost to arrive at this moment. Every bad decision, every compromise, every quiet line crossed in the service of necessity. He thought about the floor beside her empty bed, the phone that wasn't his, the message that had replaced her. He thought about Valentino Sanz driving a car sideways across a narrow exit lane. Something settled in his chest. Not absolution, not yet, and maybe not ever completely, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt, quietly and carefully, like the beginning of Forward. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Valentino's assistant placed it on the desk without comment. It had come through the building's general address, handwritten, no return name. The kind of correspondence that, in his world, warranted a degree of scrutiny before handling. She had checked it. It was clean. Just paper and whatever was inside. He looked at it for a moment before opening it. The handwriting on the front was adult, but only just careful, slightly effortful, the writing of someone who took letters seriously and had pressed the pen a little too hard in the concentration of getting them right. For the man who blocked the road. No name. No address, just that. He opened it at his desk after his afternoon calls, in the 20 minutes between the end of business and the beginning of whatever the evening required. He unfolded the single page inside, with the particular care of someone handling something that had arrived unexpectedly from a category of experience they didn't usually encounter at this desk. There were 2 things inside. The first was a drawing, done in colored pencil, the careful, earnest kind of artwork that existed in the specific register of a child who was trying very hard to represent something real rather than simply filling a page. A street, rendered in the flattened perspective of childhood drawing, but with a particular attention to detail that suggested the artist had thought about it carefully. A black car parked sideways across a lane, a tall figure standing beside it, dark suit, lines on the neck and hands that were clearly an attempt at the tattoos, a face that was more impression than portrait but that carried, somehow, something recognizable in the set of the jaw and the steadiness of the posture. A small figure standing nearby. Blonde hair, oversized coat. Both figures were surrounded by a large, slightly lopsided sun. Golden light. The second thing was a letter, short, written in the same careful, pressed hand as the envelope. Dear man who blocked the road, my name is Clara. You helped me and my dad. I wanted to say thank you because my dad said thank you, but I wanted to say it too because it was me you helped. I wasn't scared of you. I want you to know that. Some people might be scared of you, but I wasn't. I thought you looked safe. I was right. My dad is okay. I am okay. I go to school. I have a rabbit called Biscuit. I hope you are okay too. From Clara Flores. P.S. You should smile more. You have a nice face. Valentino read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at it. Outside, the city moved through its evening traffic sounds. A door somewhere below. The distant compression of ordinary life continuing in all its ordinary directions. His phone buzzed once with something that required his attention. He ignored it. He looked at the drawing, the lopsided sun, the careful attempt at his tattoos, the 2 figures it had placed together in the golden light. He had received many things at this desk over the years. Documents, proposals, confessions, payments, threats, dressed in polite language, apologies, dressed in the same. The full spectrum of what people brought to a man in his position when they needed something from him, or owed something to him, or feared what he might do next. He had never received a drawing. He had never received a letter from someone who wanted him to know they hadn't been afraid of him. Not because they were performing courage or because they needed him to believe it for strategic reasons, but simply because it was true, and they thought he should know. He sat with it for a long time. There was a particular feeling that he had been carrying since the night on Calle Meridian. The unnamed thing he'd observed in himself, while watching Raphael hold his daughter in the flat overhead light. The low, quiet hum below the sternum that didn't have a category he could file it in. He recognized it now. It was the feeling of having done something that had no strategic value, no leverage, no return, something that existed entirely outside the architecture of exchange and calculation that had governed every decision he'd made for 20 years. Something he had done simply because a child had trusted him to. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. It was not a sentimental drawer. It held practical things, tools of the work, objects that needed to be accessible but not visible. He moved these aside without ceremony. He placed the letter and the drawing at the back of the drawer. He closed it. He picked up his phone and returned the call he'd ignored. His voice, when he spoke, was the same as it always was even, controlled, carrying exactly the weight it intended to carry and no more. But something behind it had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would be visible to the person on the other end of the call, or to anyone who saw him that evening, or to the world that knew his name and kept its distance accordingly. Just shifted, the way a compass needle shifts when it finds north. Quiet, certain, pointing somewhere it hadn't pointed before. Power, Valentino had learned young, was a story other people told about you. You didn't construct it directly. You constructed the conditions, the decisions, the conduct, the lines held and the lines enforced. And then power was the narrative that accumulated around those conditions, the way sediment accumulates around a fixed point in moving water. Slow, patient, permanent. He had understood this at 19 and had been building accordingly ever since. What he hadn't understood, until recently, was that the story other people told about you was not always the story that mattered most. The Cal Meridian lot looked different in the morning. He stood at the edge of it, same spot, near the exit lane, where he had positioned himself on a Thursday afternoon that now existed in a specific and weighted way in his memory, and watched the district wake up around him. Delivery vehicles, office workers arriving, the ordinary machinery of a commercial street engaging its gears. The lot was just a lot. Asphalt and painted lines and the geometry of parked vehicles. Nothing about it announced itself as significant. No marker, no weight in the air, no visible evidence that anything had happened here. But he could place, precisely, where the SUV had parked. Where Clara had stepped out. Where she had stood when she looked up at him. Where she had mouthed 3 words with the calm deliberateness of someone who had decided, in a split second, that this particular stranger was worth trusting. He could place all of it exactly. The district had been running differently. Not loudly, nothing in his world ran loudly, and any change that announced itself was a change that had been implemented poorly, but differently in the ways that mattered. In the conversations that reached him, in the conduct of the operations under his oversight, in the texture of the relationships between the men and families who existed in the space, his name protected. The rule had held, not because people feared the consequences, though they did, and that was part of it, but because something in the specificity of the rule had communicated something larger than the rule itself. That there was a line, that the line was real, that the man who had drawn it not from strategy, but from something more durable. Several men had come to him privately in the weeks since Calle Meridian, not to challenge it, not to negotiate exceptions, to tell him, in the careful, oblique language of people unaccustomed to this category of conversation, that they were glad the rule existed, that they had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone with sufficient standing to make it. He had listened to each of them without comment. He had not told any of them about the drawing in the bottom drawer of his desk. Rafael Flores had been making his payments. Every month, on time. Through the quiet intermediary Valentino had assigned to manage the arrangement. The amounts were modest, structured to what the man's income could carry without breaking him further, and there was nothing in the transactions that resembled punishment. Just resolution. Closing a ledger that should never have been opened the way it was opened, in the service of an arrangement that should never have put a child in an SUV. Valentino had been told, through the same intermediary, small pieces of information he hadn't asked for but that were offered as context. That Rafael had changed jobs, delivery work still, but for a legitimate company with regular hours. That Clara was doing well in school. That she had been selected for something called a reading program, which apparently involved older students. That she had named her rabbit Biscuit. He hadn't asked for any of this, but he hadn't told the intermediary to stop providing it either. The thing about the story other people told, Valentino reflected, standing in the morning light of the Calle Meridian lot, was that it was always incomplete. They told the story of the blocked exit, the contained standoff, the controlled restructuring of a debt, the rule that had spread through the district like quiet water finding level ground. That was the story, precise, demonstrable, useful as currency in the conversations where his reputation was the subject. What the story didn't contain was the letter in the bottom drawer. I wasn't scared of you. I thought you looked safe. I was right. What the story didn't contain was the feeling of watching a man drop to his knees in a parking lot and hold his daughter, and the unnamed thing that had moved in his chest while he watched. What the story didn't contain was a 7-year-old walking toward him across asphalt with steady small steps, worrying about whether he was safe. Those things lived somewhere the story couldn't reach. He thought about what Clara had said to her father. He just doesn't know it yet. He wasn't sure she was right. He wasn't sure the categories of good and not good applied cleanly to a life built the way his had been built. Through the decisions he had made, and the methods he had used, and the things he had permitted himself to become, in the service of the kind of power that kept order in places where order was otherwise maintained through pure brutality. He wasn't sure, but he was thinking about it. That was new. He stood at the exit lane for another moment. The morning was cool. The light was clean and direct, not the golden amber of that Thursday afternoon, but white and clear, the kind of light that showed things as they were without the softening of dusk. A van pulled into the lot. 2 men in work clothes unloaded equipment for a business across the street. A woman walked past the entrance with a coffee and a phone, not looking up. Ordinary morning, ordinary street. He thought about a blocked exit and what it had cost him and what it had returned. He thought about restraint as power, about knowing which lines existed not for strategy but for something older and less negotiable than strategy. About a child standing in golden light with her shoulders rigid and her chin down, finding one stranger in a lot full of people who weren't looking and deciding, on the evidence of something she couldn't have articulated, that he would not look away. She had been right. He hadn't looked away. He turned from the lot and walked back toward the building. Behind him, the street continued its morning. Traffic moved. People arrived. The ordinary world went about its ordinary business, indifferent to the specific gravity of the ground it was moving across. Valentino Sanz walked through the entrance of his building, nodded to the man at the desk inside, and took the stairs to his office. He had work to do, but when he sat down at his desk, before he reached for his phone, before he opened the first folder of the morning, he pulled open the bottom drawer, looked at the drawing, the lopsided sun, the two figures in the golden light. He closed the drawer, and for the first time in a very long time, quiet, private, belonging to no one but himself, he smiled. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.
А все равно, как бы, ну, сути дела не меняет, как бы зарплата плюс-минус везде там, ну, больше, чуть меньше. Как бы, и, наверное, это все, вот эта общая ситуация, наверное, у многих привела, во-первых, сфера развлечений, да, всякие там кредиты и так далее, настолько загоняют каждого в задницу человека. И об этом на самом деле никто так-то не говорит. Какое количество сейчас, допустим, даже в те же сложные времена такие, когда вот сейчас идет там специальная военная операция, да, где люди вообще умирают, в принципе, за какую-то сумму денег. Ну, то есть, какая мотивация, то есть, у мужика идти, типа, на войну, воевать и, ну, как бы заработать денег? Потому что он вот в обычной жизни не понимает, типа, как реализовать себя. Ну, он понимает, что он может пойти работать на какую-то работу, где зарплаты его все равно не будет хватать. Как бы тут тоже двойственная сторона. Хорошо, когда она есть, плохо, когда ее нету. Да, вот это маленькая даже зарплаты. Но морально-то ты все равно подавлен. Ты понимаешь, да, я там пойду туда, но как бы смысла мне этого не принесет большого. Да, у меня там станет, если я вообще не работаю и буду работать за 50 тысяч, хорошо, что они у меня есть, я смогу там покушать себе купить, но это же дизмораль. Когда ты заходишь в интернет и видишь, как люди там в Дубае летают, покупают себе огромное количество автомобилей какие-то, ну, много всего такого, что ты за эту зарплату себе никогда в жизни позволить не сможешь. И как человеку оставаться морально, типа, сильным? Что ему нужно делать? Ну, наверное, во-первых, это, наверное, все от семьи исходит, да? То есть, какая семья у тебя, как она построена. Если ты один живешь, это сложно, да, ты будешь сам себя, но у тебя, опять-таки, возможно, ну, родители, если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, ну, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Непонятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Ну, даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию, в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то, еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей, да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось. На данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, и тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такой вот. И это борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали, а кто ты без костюма? На вот это, я филантроп, тудым-сюдым. Он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос, а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот, и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, например, там, Мелстрой, задав ему этот вопрос, а кто ты без денег? Он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку